Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the massive battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed across the endless Pacific. The date was May 28, 1942, and the combined fleet's mightiest armada was steaming toward what would become the most decisive naval engagement in the Pacific War. Yet in the pre-dawn darkness, a critical oversight was already unfolding, one that would cost the Imperial Japanese Navy its supremacy forever. Taitisen. Plan was audacious in its complexity. Operation MI, as it was designated, called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, while the main striking force would assault Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral and sand that served as America's westernmost outpost. Yamamoto believed that capturing Midway would force the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers would crush the enemy once and for all. But 600 miles to the northeast, aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise, American codebreakers had already unraveled Japan's most guarded secret. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Haipo in Pearl Harbor had been intercepting and deciphering Japanese naval communications for months. They knew not only that Midway was the target, but also the exact composition of Yamamoto's fleet, their routes of approach, and even the timing of the attack. The irony was crushing. Japan's naval intelligence had become so confident in their codes that they had grown careless with their transmissions. Radio operators chattered freely about operational details, believing their encryption was impenetrable. They had no idea that American cryptanalysts had cracked their most sacred cipher, known as JN-25, months earlier. As the sun rose on May 29th, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the mobile striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, was approaching from the northwest with 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same flat tops that had humiliated the American fleet just 6 months before, their veteran pilots flush with victory after victory across the Pacific. Meanwhile, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, was orchestrating the most elaborate trap in naval history. He had positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon where Japanese scouts would never think to look. The Americans would have the element of surprise, something they desperately needed, given their numerical disadvantage. The Japanese plan relied on several critical assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. First, they believed the American carriers were still in the South Pacific, licking their wounds from the recent Battle of the Coral Sea. Second, they assumed Midway's garrison would be caught completely off guard. Third, and most fatally, they were convinced their communications remained secure. According to historical accounts from the Naval War College Review, Japanese naval intelligence had become dangerously overconfident following their string of victories across the Pacific. This hubris would prove to be their undoing, as they failed to implement proper communication security protocols that might have concealed their intentions. As May 31st dawned, both fleets were steaming toward their fateful rendezvous, but only one side knew what was truly coming. The Americans had read Japan's mail, and now they were about to return the favor with interest. The stage was set for the most pivotal naval battle in Pacific history, one that would turn the tide of World War II and demonstrate that in warfare, intelligence was often more valuable than firepower. On the morning of June 1st, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton knocked softly on Admiral Nimitz's door at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor. In his hands were the decoded Japanese messages that would seal the fate of the Imperial Navy. The intelligence was so precise, so detailed, that Nimitz later remarked it was as if he were reading Yamamoto's personal diary. The Japanese had been transmitting in a frenzy of activity, coordinating the movements of over 100 ships spread across thousands of miles of ocean. What they didn't realize was that every message was being intercepted by American listening posts scattered across the Pacific. From the windswept hills of Hawaii to the remote stations in Australia, radio operators were capturing the electronic whispers of the approaching Japanese fleet. Commander Rochefort's team had worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. They knew that AF in the Japanese code referred to Midway, confirmed by a clever ruse where American forces transmitted a fake message about water problems on the atoll, which the Japanese promptly reported in their own communications. They knew the attack would come on June 4th. They even knew the weather forecast the Japanese were using for their planning, but knowledge alone wouldn't win the battle. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, understood that timing would be everything. His pilots would need to strike the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, when their decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. 600 miles away, Admiral Nagumo was experiencing his first taste of unease. His reconnaissance flights had been hampered by mechanical problems and poor weather. The submarine cordon that was supposed to warn him of approaching American ships had arrived too late and was positioned incorrectly. Most critically, his intelligence officers had assured him that no American carriers were within 1,000 miles of Midway. The Japanese plan called for a pre-dawn attack on Midway's airfield and installations, followed by a second wave to finish off any remaining defenses. Once the atoll was neutralized, they would establish a seaplane base and wait for the American Pacific Fleet to come charging west in a desperate attempt to recapture their lost outpost. It was then that Yamamoto's massive battle fleet, lurking 300 miles to the rear, would spring the trap and annihilate the Americans in a decisive surface engagement. Everything depended on surprise and coordination. The Japanese had timed their approach to coincide with the Aleutian attack, believing this would divide American attention and resources. What they hadn't counted on was that the Americans would ignore the northern diversion entirely, concentrating every available asset on the defense of Midway. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval history, the Japanese suffered from a fatal case of victory disease, the overconfidence that comes from an unbroken string of successes. Their intelligence gathering had become sloppy, their security protocols lax, and their strategic thinking clouded by their own propaganda. On the morning of June 2nd, American PBY Catalina flying boats began their search patterns, their crews scanning the empty ocean for the first signs of the approaching enemy. The pilots knew they were looking for the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific, but the vast expanse of water seemed to swallow everything. Hour after hour, they found nothing but endless blue waves and scattered clouds. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carriers, pilots were conducting their final briefings. Many of these men were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and countless other victories. They had never known defeat, never experienced the terror of being hunted rather than hunting. Their confidence was absolute, their morale unshakable. But confidence and morale couldn't change the fundamental reality that American codebreakers had already won the most important battle of all, the battle for information. As the sun set on June 2nd, the stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate once and for all that in modern warfare, the side that sees first often strikes first, and the side that strikes first usually wins. At 9:15 on the morning of June 3rd, 1942, Ensign Jack Reed was piloting his PBY Catalina through broken clouds 700 miles west of Midway when he spotted something that made his heart race. Stretched across the horizon like a dark smudge against the blue Pacific was the unmistakable silhouette of a massive naval formation. Reed's radio crackled to life as he transmitted the message that would echo through history. Enemy ships bearing 261, distant 700 miles. But this was not Nagumo's striking force. What Reed had discovered was Admiral Nobutake, Kondo's invasion fleet, transport ships, destroyers, and cruisers loaded with the troops intended to occupy Midway once the carriers had done their work. The main prize, the 4 aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai, remained hidden somewhere to the northwest, still undetected and still dangerous. Aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance received the contact report with mixed emotions. The enemy was finally showing himself, but these were not the carriers he desperately needed to find and destroy. Every hour that passed without locating Nagumo's flat tops was an hour closer to disaster. American intelligence had predicted the timing of the attack with remarkable precision, but the actual location of the Japanese carriers remained maddeningly elusive. The Japanese, meanwhile, were experiencing their own moment of revelation. At 5:30 on the morning of June 4th, as the first light of dawn began to creep across the Pacific, a Japanese reconnaissance plane finally spotted the American task force. The pilot's urgent radio transmission shattered the pre-dawn quiet aboard the Akagi. Enemy fleet bearing 080, distance 240 miles, course 180, speed 20 knots. Admiral Nagumo faced an agonizing decision. His first attack wave, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, was already airborne and approaching Midway. But the discovery of American ships forced him to consider whether he should launch an immediate strike against this unexpected threat or proceed with the planned assault on the atoll itself. The Japanese carriers were in a state of controlled chaos. On the hangar decks below, ordnance crews were frantically switching munitions on the aircraft of the second wave. Armor-piercing bombs intended for ships were being replaced with high-explosive and incendiary bombs for ground targets, then switched back again as new orders filtered down from the bridge. At 6:20, Tominaga's first wave reached Midway and began their attack. The small atoll erupted in flames and smoke as Japanese bombers devastated the airfield and surrounding installations, but the Americans fought back with desperate courage. Marine pilots in obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters threw themselves against the veteran Japanese airmen, knowing they were outmatched but determined to exact a price. From his command post on Eastern Island, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon watched his airfield being torn apart. The runway was cratered, fuel tanks were blazing, and several aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. But the critical installations, the power plant, the command center, and most importantly the radar station, remained functional. Midway was bloodied but not broken. As Tominaga's aircraft returned to their carriers, the lieutenant commander faced a grim reality. His own plane had been hit and was leaking fuel, but more importantly, his assessment of the damage was sobering. A second attack would be necessary to neutralize Midway completely. His radio message to Nagumo was brief but fateful. There is need for a second attack wave. According to Walter Lord's definitive account in Incredible Victory, this single message would prove to be one of the most consequential communications in naval history. Nagumo was already struggling with the decision of whether to attack the American ships or finish off Midway. Tominaga's recommendation tipped the scales toward the atoll, but even as Nagumo was making his fateful choice, American dive bombers from Midway were already approaching his carriers. Marine Captain Richard Fleming and his squadron of obsolete Vindicator dive bombers had launched from the burning airfield in a desperate attempt to strike back at their tormentors. They knew their chances of survival were minimal, but someone had to try to stop the Japanese juggernaut. The morning of June 4th had begun with the Japanese holding every advantage: superior numbers, veteran pilots, and the element of surprise. But as the sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky, those advantages were beginning to slip away, one crucial decision at a time. At 7:15 on the morning of June 4th, Admiral Nagumo made the decision that would haunt the Imperial Japanese Navy forever. Standing on the bridge of the Akagi, surrounded by his staff officers and the controlled chaos of carrier operations, he issued the order that sealed his fleet's fate. Prepare to rearm the attack planes with bombs for another strike against Midway. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching munitions for the second time that morning, lookouts reported enemy aircraft approaching from multiple directions. The first wave was a ragtag collection of Marine dive bombers and Army Air Force B-26 Marauders from Midway, followed by torpedo planes from the three American carriers lurking beyond the horizon. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney's B-26 bombers came in first, skimming the waves at masthead height in a desperate attempt to penetrate the Japanese combat air patrol. The veteran Zero pilots fell on them like hawks, shooting down several bombers and forcing the rest to jettison their ordnance without hitting anything significant. The attack accomplished nothing, except to alert the Japanese that American forces were closer than they had imagined. Next came the torpedo planes. First the lumbering TBF Avengers from Midway, then the carrier-based squadrons flying their obsolete TBD Devastators. These aircraft represented the cream of American naval aviation, but they were flying death traps. The Devastator was painfully slow, poorly armored, and carried a torpedo that often failed to explode even when it hit its target. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet in the attack that would become legendary for its courage and tragic for its outcome. Waldron had studied the Japanese fleet movements obsessively, and his intuition led him directly to Nagumo's carriers, even when the other American squadrons lost their way in the vast Pacific. "We're going in," Waldron radioed to his 15 pilots, as the 4 Japanese carriers came into view. "This is what we've trained for. Make your torpedoes count." What followed was a massacre. The Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire tore Waldron's squadron apart. One by one, the devastators plunged into the sea, their crews trapped in the burning wreckage. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket and watching the battle unfold from the water. Of the 41 American torpedo planes that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 returned to their ships. But the torpedo attacks, though tactically disastrous, achieved something far more important than their pilots could have imagined. They forced the Japanese carriers to take evasive action, breaking up their tight formation and scattering them across miles of ocean. More critically, they drew the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high altitude approaches undefended. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was growing increasingly frustrated. His carriers were under constant attack, his aircraft were still being rearmed, and intelligence reports indicated that American carriers were operating somewhere in the area. The admiral who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was beginning to feel the pressure of fighting an enemy who seemed to know his every move. As detailed in Gordon Prang's authoritative Miracle at Midway, the Japanese had fallen into a classic tactical trap. Their focus on the immediate threat from the torpedo planes had blinded them to the greater danger approaching from above. High overhead, invisible against the morning sun, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers were beginning their attack runs. At 10:20, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of the Enterprise spotted the white wakes of Japanese destroyers rushing to assist a struggling cruiser. Following those wakes like a highway, he led his dive bombers directly to the heart of Nagumo's fleet. At the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown was approaching from a different angle, having found the Japanese carriers purely by chance after their original target proved elusive. The Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable moment. Their decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, ordnance was scattered everywhere, and fuel lines snaked across the flight decks like arteries filled with aviation gasoline. The combat air patrol was still climbing back to altitude after dealing with the torpedo attacks, and the anti-aircraft gunners were focused on the wrong part of the sky. As McCluskey pushed over into his dive, he could see the rising sun emblems painted on the flight deck of the Kaga spread out below him like a perfect target. In the next 5 minutes, the entire course of the Pacific War would be decided by the skill and courage of a handful of American dive bomber pilots. At 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his SBD Dauntless into a screaming dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. Behind him, 36 more dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown followed in perfect formation, their pilots focused on the targets spread out below, like a collection of deadly toys on a blue carpet. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. Admiral Nagumo's combat air patrol was still climbing back to altitude after massacring the American torpedo planes, and the anti-aircraft gunners were frantically trying to swing their weapons skyward. Aboard the carriers, hundreds of sailors and airmen looked up in horror as the American dive bombers appeared out of the sun like vengeful angels. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the Enterprise's bombing squadron, had reserved the Akagi for himself. As he dove toward the Japanese flagship, he could see aircraft spotted on the flight deck, fuel lines snaking everywhere, and ordnance carts scattered about like deadly confetti. The carrier was a floating bomb waiting to explode, and Best held the match. At precisely 10:24, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb from 1,500 feet. The projectile punched through the Akagi's flight deck just behind the midships elevator and detonated in the upper hangar deck. The explosion touched off a chain reaction among the armed and fueled aircraft, turning the carrier into an inferno within seconds. Simultaneously, the Kaga was receiving her death blow. 3 bombs struck the veteran carrier in rapid succession, 1 penetrating the flight deck near the bridge, and 2 more hitting among the aircraft parked forward. Like her sister ship, The Kaga became a raging furnace as aviation fuel and ordnance cooked off in a series of thunderous explosions. 2 miles away, the Soryu was suffering the same fate. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown had found their target at the exact same moment, proving that sometimes in war, perfect timing is more devastating than superior numbers. 3 bombs struck the Soryu's flight deck, and within minutes she too was burning out of control. Admiral Nagumo stood on the Akagi's bridge, stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune. Just minutes before, his fleet had been supreme masters of the Pacific, preparing to deliver the TU knockout blow to American naval power. Now 3 of his 4 carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted and buckled, their hangar spaces roaring infernos that no damage control party could hope to contain. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that many Japanese officers initially refused to believe what they were seeing. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the veteran pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was aboard the Akagi recovering from appendicitis. Years later, he would write that the sight of his burning ship was like watching a beautiful woman's face destroyed by acid. But the battle was far from over. The Hiryu, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi's flagship, had been separated from the other carriers and remained undamaged. Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive spirit and tactical brilliance, immediately began preparing a counterstrike. If he could locate and destroy even one American carrier, the battle might still be salvaged. At 10:40, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from the Hiryu's deck, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the Yorktown, which had been spotted by a Japanese reconnaissance plane earlier that morning. The Americans had drawn first blood, but the Japanese weren't finished fighting. According to Mitsuo Fuchida's first-hand account in Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the scene aboard the burning Japanese carriers was one of absolute chaos. Explosions rocked the ships as stored ordnance detonated, sending geysers of flame and debris hundreds of feet into the air. Many sailors jumped overboard to escape the heat, only to be machine-gunned by American fighters strafing the fleet. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles away, received the devastating news at 11:30. His carefully crafted plan to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead resulted in the destruction of his own carrier force. The man who had warned Japan's leaders that he could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months was discovering that his time was up. The 5 minutes from 10:22 to 10:27 on the morning of June 4, 1942, would go down in history as one of the most decisive moments in naval warfare. In that brief span, American dive bombers had destroyed the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy and shifted the balance of power in the Pacific forever. But even as the Japanese carriers burned, their surviving aircraft were already launching counterstrikes against the American fleet. The Battle of Midway was about to enter its final, most desperate phase, where the outcome would depend on which side could absorb more punishment and still keep fighting. The Hiryu's counterattack struck like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. At 12:10 p.m. on June 4th, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi's dive bombers appeared over the American task force, their pilots determined to avenge their burning comrades. The Yorktown, already identified by Japanese reconnaissance, became the focus of their fury. Despite the desperate efforts of her combat air patrol and anti-aircraft gunners, 3 bombs penetrated the Yorktown's defenses. The first struck near the island's superstructure, knocking out the radar and killing many of the men in the signal bridge. The second punched through the flight deck and exploded in the lower decks, starting fires that threatened the ship's magazines. The third bomb damaged the uptakes to the boilers, reducing the carrier's speed to 6 knots. But American damage control teams, trained by the harsh lessons of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, worked miracles. Within 2 hours, they had restored power, extinguished the major fires, and gotten the Yorktown back up to 20 knots. To Japanese reconnaissance pilots circling overhead, she appeared to be a different ship entirely, leading them to believe they had discovered a second American carrier. Admiral Yamaguchi, still flying his flag aboard the Hiryu, seized upon this intelligence to launch a second strike. At 2:30 p.m., 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters roared off the Hiryu's deck, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the dawn attack on Midway and whose fuel-starved plane had, sealed the morning's fateful decisions. This second attack found the Yorktown again, and this time her luck ran out. 2 torpedoes struck the port side, flooding the engine rooms and knocking out all power. The carrier took on a severe list and seemed destined to capsize, forcing Captain Elliot Buckmaster to order abandon ship. The vessel that had survived, the Coral Sea and fought gallantly at Midway, was finally succumbing to her wounds. But the Americans weren't finished either. Even as the Yorktown's crew was abandoning ship, dive bombers from the Enterprise were approaching the Hiryu. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who had delivered the morning's knockout blow, was wounded and flying on borrowed time, but his pilots were hungry for revenge. At 5 p.m., 24 dauntless dive bombers found Admiral Yamaguchi's flagship. The Hiryu fought back desperately, her anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with deadly flak, but she was alone and outnumbered. 4 bombs struck the carrier's flight deck and hangar spaces, turning her into the same kind of blazing wreck that had claimed her sisters that morning. Admiral Yamaguchi faced the same agonizing decision that had confronted Nagumo earlier. But unlike his superior, Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. As flames consumed the Hiryu's hull, he radioed a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "Our ship is damaged and unable to proceed. We will fight to the last man." By sunset on June 4th, all 4 of Japan's premier aircraft carriers were burning or sunk. The Kido Butai, which had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had ceased to exist. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead or missing, along with most of Japan's veteran carrier pilots, losses that the Imperial Navy would never be able to replace. The American victory came at a significant cost. The Yorktown was abandoned and would later be sunk by a Japanese submarine. 147 American aircrew had died in the attacks, including Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his entire torpedo squadron. But these losses paled in comparison to what the Japanese had suffered. As documented in Edwin Hoyt's comprehensive Blue Skies and Blood, the Battle of Midway marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Never again would the Imperial Navy possess the strength to mount a major offensive operation. The initiative had passed permanently to the Americans, who would use it to launch an island-hopping campaign that would carry them all the way to Tokyo Bay. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's early victories, understood immediately what had happened. In losing 4 aircraft carriers and their irreplaceable aircrew, Japan had lost the war. The industrial might of America would ensure that. The carriers could be replaced, but the experienced pilots who had died in the burning wrecks could not. The supreme naval planners who had missed Midway's signals had paid the ultimate price for their overconfidence. Their failure to properly secure their communications, their underestimation of American capabilities, and their rigid adherence to an overly complex battle plan had combined to create one of the most stunning reversals in military history. The sun set on June 4, 1942. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned forever. The Japanese fleet that had awakened the sleeping giant at Pearl Harbor had finally met its match in the blue waters around a tiny atoll called Midway. The age of American naval supremacy in the Pacific had begun, and it would not end until Japanese representatives signed the surrender documents aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay 3 years and 3 months later.